Alright, let's take things back to the late 90s. Coming from the suburbs of Detroit, a name was starting to buzz in hip-hop's underground. Marshall Mathers, aka Eminem. He was competing in rap battles and joined the ranks of an up-and-coming rap collective, and had a new alter ego to go with it. He got a feature in the Source's unsigned hype column, followed by a demo tape which would make its way into the hands of Dr. Dre. Landing a deal at Interscope Records, he began work on his major label debut, and in late 98, the world would get a taste of what was to come, with a feature on Kid Rock's major label debut, a song aptly titled Puff Goff. Now at this point, no one outside of hip-hop's most dedicated underground fans knew who this Slim Shady was. But a few short months later in 1999, he would take over radio and TV, and for the next half a decade, he would dominate pop culture. Behind the scenes, however, everything was falling apart. He was facing a litany of problems, from lawsuits and legal troubles to marital issues and a sleeping pill addiction. This would take nearly everything from him: his career, family, and even his life. What's up, everybody? It's your friendly neighborhood white boy here. And today, I've got something a little bit different. I've been working on a music project, and as a part of that project, I've been revisiting all of the stuff that I grew up on, and the stuff that got me into music in the first place. So in today's video, I wanted to take a look at the era of Eminem that defined my formative years. That being what I'm calling his comeback era, from around 2009 to 2013. For me, it's an era that will always hold a special place in my heart, and an era that I don't think gets enough recognition. Just to set the scene here, these years were pretty rough for me. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but I was stuck between a mother that I had never-ending relationship issues with and a drug-addicted, largely absent father. I had few friends and frequently got in trouble in school, and would eventually find myself attending an alternative school. Naturally, I was into all of the angry and alternative white boy music, from Slipknot and Korn to Tyler the Creator and Atmosphere, and of course, Eminem. So this video is meant to be as much a love letter as it is a retrospective. But that's enough rambling about me. Let's get on with the video.
I'm out to accomplish a lot of things, and I want to have a voice in hip-hop. I want to have a voice. I want to be able to speak and people listen. I felt like I was being overlooked as far as like having any talent or anything. I felt like my talent was like secondary, and everybody wanted to keep talking about my lyrics, you know?
Well, let's see. For the past 2 years, I put out a fucking album. I got arrested. I got divorced. I got fucking arrested. I got out. I got off.
At the point that I'm at right now in my career, I don't know where I'm at in my career.
Before we get into his actual comeback, I think we need to establish the years just prior to that, so we can understand why he had a comeback in the first place. As I already mentioned in the introduction, around the turn of the millennium, Eminem was on top of the world.
Hey, Rob, since you like your neck eyes so much, why don't you introduce our next video?
He was one of the biggest musicians ever, having sold tens of millions of records. However, he also had his detractors. Parents and advocacy groups protested and fought his music, and along with that, legal troubles, lawsuits, and marital problems plagued his personal life. He had feuds with everyone from Benzino and Ja Rule.
I don't want to talk about it no more. For 22 years, every time I do an interview, they ask me about Eminem. The fuck you want me to do?
To ICP and Everlast, and for some reason, Christopher Reeves. And while filming his feature film debut, 8 Mile, in 2002, he had picked up a habit to sleeping medication. As addictions always go, it started small.
It's a lot of work, you know, going back and forth, trying to write the music and memorize the lines and do the scenes. But it all starts to blend together as one. It's just constantly moving, but I'm used to constantly moving.
He found himself taking things like NyQuil to cope with the long filming hours. But on set, someone would introduce him to Ambien, which would eventually turn into Vicodin, Valium, and other barbiturates. This would be a major contributor to his next album, Encore, being a bit of a mixed bag. To be more specific, late in 2003, a bunch of tracks meant for the album would leak online. It's believed that a friend of his little brother Nate had found and stole a demo CD. Now, at the time, the music industry was still trying to figure out how to navigate this new digital world. Internet piracy and leaks were becoming more common, and early streaming services like YouTube were slowly taking over the landscape. In Marshall's case, it meant replacing half the tracks with lazy and last-minute drug-fueled garbage. So tracks like We As Americans and Bully were replaced with tracks like Big Weenie and Rain Man. And while some dedicated fans might find these tracks amusing, it resulted in an album that was, by all accounts, a lackluster follow-up to the Eminem Show. The failure of this album drove him further into his depression, addiction, and writer's block. And he would become increasingly uncertain about the future of his career.
So is this your last album?
I don't know.
Is your last tour?
Don't know. I really don't know.
Still, in 2005, he would embark on the third anger management tour with 50 Cent and G-Unit, D12, Obi Trice, and a few others. The tour wound up being a bit of a mess on all fronts, though. To start with, ticket sales were lower than expected, which many attribute to the exorbitant prices of upwards of $60. Due to scheduling conflicts, 50 Cent would miss the first few shows, and in New York, Lloyd Banks and Young Buck would be arrested on weapons charges. One of the buses would also get into a crash with a tractor trailer, and during shows, Marshall would frequently make comments about how he might not be doing this much longer, and his career might be coming to a close. It was increasingly obvious to fans that he was not in a good place. After finishing the North American leg of the tour, Marshall would cancel the European leg, with his publicist at the time stating that it was because he was being treated for exhaustion. A few days later, the full truth would come out. Marshall had checked himself into the Brighton rehab facility for a sleeping pill addiction. However, this wasn't something that he himself really wanted to do or felt he needed to do. He was still in denial that he had an addiction. The way he saw it was he had a sleeping problem, not a pill problem.
And I think I was convinced at that time, like, I'm not an addict. You know, I even had trouble, like, saying it in group meetings and shit like that. Like, I'm not an addict. This is, you know, something I can fix. This is a sleep problem. I'm going to go to a sleep clinic. I'm going to see.
In fact, he later recalled that in those years, he would flip out at people who would bring up the issue and would even cut them out of his life. He did a few weeks in Brighton before deciding to leave, partly because, being Eminem, it was hard for him to be just left alone. After leaving, the first order of business was to get back into the studio. However, his dwindling confidence and writer's block was worsened by his newfound, albeit temporary, sobriety. For a time, he found himself struggling to pen anything. Eventually, he would manage to get a few songs written, namely When I'm Gone and Beautiful. As 2005 was coming to an end, he would announce Curtain Call, a greatest hits album, the name being a not-so-subtle nod to the idea that he was considering retiring. And in interviews, he said as much. Alongside the hits, the album contained 3 new tracks, the aforementioned When I'm Gone, Shake That, and what many considered to be his magnum opus, Back. By this point, though, he was relapsing back into his pill habit, and things began to spiral more. During a radio interview for the release of Curtain Call, he would make a bombshell announcement. He was getting back together with his longtime, off and on again girlfriend, Kim. And not only that, they planned to get married once again.
You know, my wife, Kim, she is like the biggest, you know, she's waiting in line to get him.
I want to stop for a second. You just said my wife, Kim. Are you and Kim back together?
Yes, we are back together.
That's good.
And we have reconciled and are probably going to remarry.
Wow. That's great.
As always, the relationship was fraught with innumerable issues. A leaked track called 50 Ways gives a little insight into their relationship at the time. As expected, the relationship wouldn't last more than a few months, as by early April, the pair would file for divorce. Only a week later, on April 11th, Marshall's childhood best friend, Deshaun Holden, would be killed at the CCC Club in Detroit. His death was a massive blow to Marshall, and it's around this time most consider his hiatus to have really started. He had already taken a bit of a step back, but now he would become a full-blown recluse, only to be seen in occasional photographs, a few leaked tracks, and a few featured verses. His depression and pill addiction would spiral over the next year and get worse and worse. The few pictures we have of him from the time, he looked bloated and overweight, beyond miserable, and had a blank look of despair in his eyes. Tracks leaked from the time showcase him slurring and mumbling his way through verses, barely able to enunciate. One might assume this is where Lil Xan got his inspiration from. Marshall recalls that by this point he was taking upwards of 60 pills a day. Just a few years prior, he was on top of the world. Now, he was slowly rotting away in his mansion. By 2007, the public had more or less moved on from him, and the world of hip-hop was changing without him. There was word that he was working on new music, an album called King Mathers, according to Shady Records artist Cassius. Taking all of the leaked tracks from this album and piecing them together, it creates an album that was most certainly meant to be his last. The album has long been a point of fascination among devoted fans, with speculation of what the final track listing would have been. But one thing's for sure, it wouldn't have been good. It would have been an absolutely pitiful and weak final album for a man who, at one point, had pop culture by the balls. And deep down, I think he knew that, but none of that would matter, because in December of 2007, just a few days before Christmas, he would take some methadone pills given to him by a friend and collapse on his bathroom floor.
You know, I feel like I almost feel like I'm reintroducing myself to the world. You know, like, you know, this is, I mean, I got a second win. It's kind of what I feel like right now, you know?
2 days later, Marshall woke up in the hospital. He'd overdosed on the methadone and had been left comatose. Word given at the press at the time was that he had just suffered a bout of pneumonia, which wasn't technically a lie. Now, not only had he OD'd, he also missed Christmas, which was also Haley's 13th birthday. By most accounts, Marshall always tried to be the best father he could, even during his darkest days.
What kind of a dad is he? He's an excellent father. He loves the kids very much.
Feeling guilty having missed those two events, he checked himself out of recovery after only about a week. It was far too early, but his mind was on his daughters and not himself. Returning home, he had almost no strength, recalling that he could barely even lift the salt and pepper shaker. And being that he was no longer taking dozens of sleeping pills per day, his nerves and senses were going haywire. Not too long after returning home, he tore his meniscus taking a nap on the couch. He went in for surgery a couple of days later, but was obviously not prescribed any sort of pain medication due to his previous addiction. After returning home from the hospital, once again, he suffered a seizure. Looking for some kind of reprieve, he scavenged his house looking for any leftover pills, and in the basement, wrapped inside of a napkin, he found a handful of Vicodin and Valium. Within a few weeks, his pill habit was picking right back up where it had left off. Thankfully, Marshall would begin to come to his senses.
And from there, I really went downhill. And that's when I overdosed, got out the hospital, relapsed a short time after that, basically scared out of myself, and went to some people and was like, yo, I got a problem, I need help, I can't beat this on my own. Because the whole time I think I was thinking that I could, but I couldn't.
He relapsed back in 2005, overdosed in 2007, and was relapsing once again. And he realized that he would just keep repeating this cycle if he didn't quit now. So he decided to get help and finally tackle his addiction. At first, he would try, in his words, a couple of churches and things, but being one of the world's biggest musicians, it was hard for him to just exist, which is the same problem that he had in Brighton just a few years prior. Eventually, he would just seek out a private rehab counselor and ask Elton John to be a sponsor, who had dealt with his own addiction issues. He also began getting his physical health into check after not taking care of himself for 4 years and gaining weight, although he may have gone a little too hard. In his mind, he thought that he should be like Christian Bale in The Machinist, which, as he recalls, was, quote, Really fucking stupid. In order to achieve that, he was running upwards of 18 miles per day, which was actually damaging his hip flexors. But he was now sober, losing weight, if even a little too much, and working on becoming a new person and better father. There was one problem, however. Due to his newfound sobriety and because of his overdose, he was struggling to write and rap. By March, he was back in the studio, but he was finding himself having to figure everything out all over again. He decided to move on from all of the material that he'd been working on throughout his hiatus and focused on writing fresh, new material instead. And surprisingly, we actually do have a little look into what he was writing at the time. In 2011, a track called Detroit Basketball would leak online. It would later be confirmed that this was one of the first tracks he wrote and recorded around that time. And it's not great.
I'm talking to you. You already know what to do. Just pass it to me.
In fact, when Paul Rosenberg heard the track, he was concerned that Marshall may have suffered some kind of brain damage from his overdose.
Didn't you ask the doctors when I started recording new shit, when I first started rapping again and sent it to you? Didn't you say, like, I just want to make sure he doesn't have brain damage?
Yeah, I thought you might have some permanent problems. Yeah, I was concerned for sure.
Detroit basketball.
Looking back, it was clearly just Marshall learning the ropes all over again. And I say that from personal experience as someone who's just been writing a lot of nonsense in recent months. Marshall even recalled that he wrote dozens of different versions of the song, and he's not entirely certain which version ultimately leaked.
And if you remember, I don't know which version leaked, but if you remember, there was like 20 versions of that shit.
As mid-2008 rolled around, he began working with Dr. Dre again. Since he was still trying to figure things out, they devised a little system where Dre would give him a CD full of beats, and he would go into a separate room and just write as he saw fit. Eventually, he found that everything was coming back to him.
But, it didn't take long after that time period started that you all of a sudden were, like, really back in it. It was quick. It was certainly concerning, but we're only talking about a course of maybe 5 or 6 months total.
And not just his post-sobriety overdose, but the writer's block and creative slump that he had found himself in for the past 5 or so years was going away. Over the course of the next few months, he began churning out material, enough for possibly 2 or maybe even 3 albums. He was also starting to hone in on the theming and the style of the next album. However, at this point, Marshall was still technically on his hiatus and had largely been missing from the public eye for the past few years. So at this point, it was time for him to start creeping back into the public sphere and reintroducing himself. That same year, he had also begun working on an autobiography, The Way I Am, which was to be released in October. He would host a release party for the book, which would mark his first post-overdose public appearance. At the event, he would also announce that he had a new album coming, along with a name for the project. Now, by this point, the broader cultural zeitgeist had almost moved on from Eminem, and hip-hop specifically had a new crop of up-and-coming names like Kanye, Drake, and Wiz Khalifa. So, of course, this begs the question, with the changing landscape of music and pop culture, how would Eminem make his return? And how would he fit into this new landscape? In February of 2009, we would get the answer to that question with the release, Crack a Bottle. It is admittedly a little bit odd that Eminem's first new single post-sobriety was a club song. That being said, the song was a pretty solid return to form, and honestly sounds like it could have came straight out of 2004, but still kind of worked with the recession pop landscape at the time. And while the track was overall nothing special or remarkable, it's pretty good for someone who, just a few months prior, was writing tracks like Detroit Basketball. However, this song was more of a promotional single and was actually originally meant for 50's new album. A few months later, we would get the first proper single for Relapse, the track We Made You.
Guess who? You miss me? Jessica Simpson, sing the chorus.
This track felt like a much more proper reintroduction and comeback song. It's a song that brings back that classic Shady sound and does what Shady does best. Comedic and satirical raps about pop culture and celebrities.
There's some celebrity bashing in it. I want to say it's not necessarily taking deliberate shots at people. Yes, it is.
fuck am I talking about?
The video, directed by Joseph Kahn, is chock full of pop culture references from the time and sort of acts as a time capsule for the turn of the decade. It's got things like Eminem rapping over a Guitar Hero parody and dressing like Bret Michaels, who had a reality show at the time, Rock of Love, or him dressing as John Mayer. It's got Lisa Ann, who was huge at the time, resuming her role as Sarah Palin, who was a big name due to the 2008 election. You have Trisha Paytas, yes, you heard that correctly.
Hi, how are you? Trisha.
Playing Jessica Simpson in her role as Daisy in the recent Dukes of Hazzard movie. There's also a spoof on Kim Kardashian, who at the time I think was still mostly known for her tape with Ray J, but Keeping Up with the Kardashians might have been a thing. And numerous other spoofs and parodies from Amy Winehouse and Ellen DeGeneres to Britney Spears and Lindsay Lohan and much more. And while some might argue that in ways this could date the song and video, I think it was the right choice at the time. And I think sometimes, especially now, people can be a little obsessed with making sure that nothing dates a music video or movie or video game to a specific time period. So it's refreshing to see something that is just a product of its time.
Oh, bubbles, bubbles, no, bubbles. Ow, boulder popped in my eye, goddammit.
The third single for the album would take a much different and much darker turn. On April 23rd, just a few days after the 1-year anniversary of his sobriety, Eminem would release 3 AM. A horrorcore track that would set the tone for the rest of the album. Now, Marshall had toyed with horrorcore before, and back home in Detroit, it's a staple with artists like ICP and Esham. But this was Eminem's first real dive into the genre. Instead of comedic and silly raps lampooning celebrities, he was making crude references to jerking off to Miley Cyrus or shoving a flashlight up Kim Kardashian's ass. Now that I say that out loud, that kind of just sounds like Eminem. But the point being, it was dark and edgy, not comedic and lighthearted. The video, which premiered on Cinemax at 10 p.m., explores the concept of the song and album even further. The video portrays Eminem and Shady in a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sort of way. We see the drug-addicted Slim Shady escape from Popsum Hills, a fictional rehab facility used in marketing for the album. And later, we see a sober Marshall trying to figure out what he did the night before. I imagine this was relatively surprising for the public at the time, as even for Eminem standards, the lyrics and imagery were quite violent and sadistic. I mean, sure, he had songs like Amityville and Kim, but those were deeper album cuts, not lead singles. And anyone that was worried that a sober Eminem might have dulled or lost his edge was also probably pleasantly surprised. As the release of the album drew near, fans were waiting with bated breath to see what Marshall had to offer upon his return. It had been 4 years since his last album, which was a bit of a letdown, but now he was back. And tentatively, it seemed like he was more motivated and disciplined than ever before. Relapse released on May 15th, 2009, debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200 and selling over 600,000 copies in its first week. However, the reception from both fans and critics was a little mixed. But let's talk a little more about the album first before we get into that. The album sits at a whopping 20 tracks, all but one of them produced by Dr. Dre, that being the song Beautiful, which is a bit of an outlier in the album. It was actually one of the songs that he wrote after his first stint in rehab all the way back in 2005, which is why the song feels tonally and thematically a little bit different than the rest of the album. The album starts off with the Dr. West skit in which a doctor at a rehab facility Marshall is checking out of turns into a monster, presumably Slim Shady. Little side note, actually, the alarm clock and the yell in this skit was actually originally a part of the 2007 version of My Darling, a track presumed to have been meant for the King Mathers album, but was later repurposed as a bonus track for Relapse.
Oh, shit.
The album then kicks into gear with the aforementioned single, 3 AM, before going through a litany of different horrorcore tracks. Songs like My Mom take a very black humor approach to his drug addiction and how it started. Insane is, well, insane. And tracks like Same Song and Dance and Stay Wide Awake could easily be ripped from a brutal death metal album. Lyrically, that is. There's a few skits, like any classic Eminem album has, and there's a couple of tracks like Deja Vu and Beautiful that take themselves more seriously and talk more openly and plainly about his struggles the past 4 or 5 years. So why was the reception to the album mixed? It certainly wasn't the production or mixing. In that regard, it's solid, and I would argue his best post-hiatus. It's got all of the classic shady offerings from vulgar wordplay and pop culture lampooning and skits that help the album tell a story. The reason the album was controversial mostly comes down to the use of accents. Throughout the album, he's using these weird, sort of nonsensical accents. This wasn't exactly new for Marshall. He did use some accents way back in Encore, but they were stronger here than ever, and they really divided fans and critics alike. The way Marshall recalls it is that he tends to get really obsessive with things, and around the time he had really gotten into serial killers from watching shows, documentaries, and movies.
Okay, a couple things come into play. One, I had just started watching a bunch of like fucking serial killer documentaries and shit.
Right, because there's a fucking lot of them out there.
Yeah, and it's like it started giving me ideas. Like I could, if I tried to sound like a demented fucking serial killer.
And I guess in his mind, serial killers have goofy accents. I mean, I suppose Jeffrey Dahmer is from Wisconsin. That being said, although the accents might go a little overboard, they do help him achieve some incredible flows and wordplay.
What I had always thought was that you were using the accents to bend words.
Well, that too.
To make them fit together,
Yep.
right? Because if you say a word a certain way, it's going to connect with another word that it might not otherwise connect with.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I assumed.
Lately, I've been using vocal tracks to practice my singing, and I've even thrown in a few rap songs here and there. And let me tell you, Stay Wide Awake is a hell of a track. That and many other songs on the album have some of his best rhyme schemes and wordplay, period. I think few refute that. And in many ways, the album was a love letter to rapping. It was simultaneously Marshall relearning how to rap all over again, while also proving that he's still the best. And while at the time it was met with mixed reception, the album does have its defenders, notably Tyler the Creator, who was heavily influenced by the album, which, if you're only familiar with modern Tyler, probably makes no sense. I would also critique the album for not really fully delivering on the actual concept. And this is a regular problem that Eminem has. He has really good concepts for albums, but that always sort of fizzles out partway through the album. So much so that it's actually become a thing within the fan base to recreate track lists in ways that better suit the album and follow through with the concept of the album. All in all, I think if he had eased up on the accents and maybe restructured the track list a little bit and maybe cut it down to like 12 tracks, seriously, I am begging rappers, stop putting like 20 tracks on every album. I think this album would be much less controversial and would be more broadly regarded as one of his best. But this was only the beginning. The main takeaway of the album was that Shady was back and better than he had been in years. To whatever extent Relapse was panned, it was certainly better than Encore and the King Mathers album that never saw the light of day. Over the next couple of years, Eminem would take on pop culture and regain his spot at the top once again, all while reinventing himself in the public eye.
These past couple of years have been a pretty big growing experience for me as a person, as an artist. Like,
if you do Sarah Palin, people might think, oh, he wants to make a statement about Sarah Palin or American politics.
I want to nail her, but
There can be an Eminem record with me being happy. You know, there can't really be a happy Eminem record. The whole concept of the record with the whole recovery theme is kind of like just me kind of walking off into the sunset, I guess.
2010. Not just a new year, but a new decade. And I remember it being a time of change. Some of that may have been the Bush era was coming to an end, But there was definitely some cultural shifts happening. While the mid to late 2000s had seen media going in a bit of a darker and edgier direction, the 2010s was shaping up to be colorful, loud, and optimistic. Music was being taken over by loud and anthemic recession pop. TikTok, single ladies, Poker Face, and I Got a Feeling all dominated the radio. And Eminem was no exception. This would be the year he would release not only one of his biggest albums, but an album that, for Eminem standards, was quite positive and motivational. An album that would completely redefine and reintroduce Eminem in the public eye. An album that would bring him to heights comparable to, or even greater than early in his career. Marshall would dominate pop culture once again, but in a different way. Okay, let's back things up a little bit to Relapse and its planned sequel. As mentioned earlier, Marshall had drafted and written enough material to fill out 2 or maybe even 3 albums. And since he had been gone so long, he wanted to give fans a sequel to Relapse in order to give them more music. And while Marshall was initially really proud of the album, as time went on, he slowly began to sour on the album over the next year. In the summer of 2009, Marshall and Dre began some sessions in Avex Honolulu Studios in Hawaii. There, they wrote songs like So Bad, On Fire, and the Mariah Carey diss track that would come out later that year. These songs were tonally quite different from Relapse. Whether that was a conscious decision or not, he was dropping the accents and the horrorcore themes and lyrics. Since the year was coming to an end and there was still no Relapse 2, Marshall took some leftover tracks from the Relapse sessions and released them as a bonus edition of Relapse called Refill. Just a little something to hold fans over while he figured out what he wanted to do. Sometime after releasing Refill, Marshall decided to scrap Relapse 2. His opinion on the album had changed, and the new material he'd been writing in Hawaii was sounding a lot different. On April 13th, he'd post a tweet officially announcing that there was no Relapse 2, followed by a link to his website. That link contained the announcement and name of his next album, Recovery. A couple of weeks after that, the first single from the album would be released, that being the absolutely massive hit, Not Afraid.
I'm not afraid. Yeah. It's been a ride.
A song that I think needs little, if any, introduction. This was easily one of the biggest songs of the year and overall one of his biggest songs, period. The song was very different from anything we had heard on Relapse, with accents along with the horrorcore lyrics being gone. There wasn't even any spoofing or mocking of celebrities. It was just an upbeat, motivational anthem championing his sobriety. And I think it's easy to forget just how different this song was for Eminem at the time, not just in comparison to Relapse, but overall. This was not an artist who was known for writing upbeat songs with a positive outlook. The closest would be something like Till I Collapse, but even that had a level of vitriol and angst that Not Afraid did not have. This is also when song parodies were getting really big on YouTube, and so of course, everyone had to do their own parody of this. I mean, the song does lend itself to parody quite well. The Key of Awesome's parody is probably the most famous of these parodies.
His rapping is hilarious or completely serious, and if you make fun of him, then he will get freaking furious. Cause he can dish it out, but he just can't take it, like a baker who hates cake, but always bakes it.
And as far as poorly aged YouTube parodies go, it's not too bad. And of course, there was the College Humor version.
What did you read about that one guy who got buried alive? They went and put him in the ground without checking if he had died. Not afraid to stand up here and speak what's on my mind. And holy crap, can you imagine waking up in a coffin confined?
And those are just the decent ones. There is a gold mine of just absolutely awful parodies you can find of that song.
I shy away from public settings, hyperventilate at funerals, and I'm terrified of weddings.
Don't wanna hear what you think. The answer's velocity. I guess you got it right, cause it's time to move on. Ain't no way you're stopping me.
I'm so out of here when it comes to heights, I have a fear. I'm going home, I don't wanna work anymore. Who locked the door?
Not to send hate to any of those people. It's just kind of funny to look back on. I think these parodies also show just how much culture had changed in a few years. In 2008 or 2009, an Eminem parody is something that only Weird Al would have done.
Oh, there's Anna Nicole.
Oh, what's the matter?
Don't you like it?
No, it's ridiculous. It's repetitive, and it gets on my nerves.
And now everyone was doing it. But I also think it shows just how massive that song was. No song on Relapse came even close to being as big as Not Afraid, and Recovery was shaping up to be an absolutely monumental album.
I'm not afraid. Yeah. Buy Eminem's new album Recovery. It stores June 21st. Side effects may include a better appreciation for rap, happiness, oily anal discharge, parents telling you to turn it down, UFOs, and lots more. Ask your doctor if Eminem's Recovery is right for you. Call now.
Riding on the massive wave of success of Not Afraid, Recovery released on June 18th, 2010, alongside its second single, the even bigger hit, Love the Way You Lie.
I can't tell you what it really is. I can only tell you what it feels like.
A pop rap song featuring Rihanna, which is a little funny considering some years later a song from the Relapse era would leak where Marshall makes some pretty edgy jokes about her relationship with Chris Brown. But that aside, that song and the album were absolutely massive. Rihanna was one of the biggest pop stars of the time, and that no doubt helped Marshall rise to the top once again. And as with Not Afraid, there were many cheesy YouTube parodies of the song, but I'm not going to spend time going over those. In terms of pure numbers, Recovery was considerably more successful than Relapse. It outdid Relapse's first week sales of 600,000 by over 150,000, and would be one of the best-selling albums of the year and the best-selling digital album, only to be outdone by Adele's 21. And it's worth keeping in mind that this is when album sales were really starting to take a nosedive. Internet piracy and streaming services like Pandora and YouTube were widely available at this point and had more or less taken over the industry.
Always purchase music through authorized retailers that pay royalties to the artist.
But what of the album itself? If Relapse was met with mixed reception, was this album received more positively? I would say largely so, but not unanimously so. The album was a definite tonal shift for Eminem, being a much poppier and much more upbeat album with a generally more positive outlook. Not to say that it's a happy album by any means, but for Eminem standards, it's downright peachy.
Eminem, are you having fun?
The production also saw Marshall working with a litany of different producers from Boy Wonder, DJ Khalil, Just Blaze, and Alex the Kid, the only Dre songs being So Bad and Rydas, which were from the Hawaii sessions. And I kind of have mixed feelings about this. While it was cool to see Marshall branch out and work with new and different producers, I do think this was the start of a problem. Not just for Eminem, but for hip-hop as a whole. This is around the time that hip-hop and rappers started to embrace the idea of every beat, every song being produced by a different producer. Not to say that was a new idea by any means, but this is when it really became the standard. And I think this has largely been a negative for hip-hop. I think because of it, albums feel less sonically cohesive or lack a distinctive style, and every rapper sounds like every other rapper. And so while it was neat at the time, I do kind of wish this had been the beginning and end of that, which then leads into another problem with not only this album, but his following albums, the mixing. While far from his worst in regards to mixing, that crown handedly goes to Revival. The album's mixing is kind of loud and flat, and to be fair, that was sort of the sound and style at the time, but it's a sound that hasn't aged particularly well. And paired with his increasingly shouty and staccato flow, it can make the album a little abrasive to listen to at times. I also don't think the central concept of the album is utilized as well as it could be. Really, only the songs Not Afraid, Talking to Myself, and Changes are directly about, recovery. The song White Trash Party in particular feels very odd and out of place on the album. I'm not sure why post-sobriety Marshall continues to make songs about partying or doing drugs. I feel like someone maybe needs to introduce him to straight edge hardcore or something to show him that he can in fact make songs championing his sobriety. As I said earlier, Eminem is great at coming up with concepts for albums and then not fully delivering on them. Now, all this makes it sound like I dislike the album, but believe me, I don't. I actually really love the album, which, to be fair, might partly be nostalgia, but I do think the album has its upsides. While the album does see Eminem experimenting with a more contemporary poppy sound, it does blend in some old school hip hop influences with songs like On Fire, Cold Wind Blows, and Cinderella Man, which are all just plain old rap songs that even see Eminem bringing back punchline raps.
Get it? Raising the bar? Get it? Yeah!
Something that was really big back in the day, especially in the hip-hop shop crowd, but were being brought back into popularity with rappers like Lil Wayne, who also had a feature on the album. And while I've never personally cared for Wayne, I know a lot of people were excited about that at the time. I also really like the pop influences, which I know can be very divisive when artists or bands try to embrace pop sensibilities in some capacity. And I think in the worlds of rock and rap music, we can be a little dismissive of them in ways that can be somewhat detrimental. The poppier approach, including featuring singers like Rihanna and Pink, no doubt helped bring this album and Marshall himself back to heights that he had not seen in years. Overall, I think the album was a very triumphant return to the top for Marshall. He was once again dominating pop culture and had again made himself a household name. Lastly, as someone who comes from a background of addiction, I also really love what the album represents and what it showcases. Marshall not only beat his addiction, but he clearly also changed significantly as a person. And believe me, I know a lot of people that quit taking meth, quit taking pills, and that's about it. They still drink, they still smoke weed, they still have attitude or behavioral problems. They don't take care of their physical health, they don't really change how they treat people, they don't try to learn new stuff or push themselves out of their comfort zone or learn new things. Marshall did those things, and I find that to be really endearing and inspiring. He actually committed to sobriety and became a better father and a better Eminem. He tried new stuff musically and was able to redeem and revitalize his public image. So while I do think that Marshall fumbled the actual concept of recovery a little bit, I think the album still stands as a reminder of his changes as an artist and a human being. And I do wish that would get a little more recognition and attention instead of people just complaining that he's not like he used to be or that he used to be better on drugs or whatever.
I like Royce the 5'9" a lot too. Okay. He's one of those guys that should be bigger than he is. Okay. You know, but he's dope.
All right, let's rewind a few years here. Back in 2008, when Marshall was working on his sobriety, there was a news story that flew under the radar. Eminem and Royce da 5'9" squash beef. I'm not going to go over the whole story here, but we need just a little context and background here. Marshall and Royce's friendship goes back to 1997, when they met at a concert that Royce had performed at. The pair hit it off and would immediately form a rap duo called Bad Meets Evil, and released a double single in 1998. And on the Slim Shady LP, they would have a track called Bad Meets Evil. However, shortly after this, they would have a falling out. Fast forward some years later, and Proof was working to squash all of Marshall's beefs. In 2003, Proof and Royce wound up in jail together, and they would make amends and tentatively with Em and Royce. However, it would take a few more years for them to properly rekindle their friendship. That being in 2008, after Cassius made some comments about Royce that led to them getting together and reconciling. Now, at the time, this wasn't particularly huge news. I think largely because most Eminem fans were not super familiar with Bad Meets Evil. Now, around that time, Royce had joined up with Joe Budden, Joel Ortiz, and King Crooked and formed the group Slaughterhouse. As early as 2009, there were rumors of Slaughterhouse being signed to Shady Records, and those rumors would be confirmed in 2010 after Joel Ortiz would make some tweets expressing frustration with E1 Entertainment getting in the way of a deal with Shady Records. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because this caused some speculation that maybe a Bad Meets Evil reunion was on the horizon. And in late 2010, that question was more or less answered when a couple of tracks, Echo and Living Proof, would leak online. Surprisingly, I don't actually remember those leaking at the time. I'm not sure if I just happened to miss that or maybe I just memory hold them. But either way, after those leaks, there was some growing excitement about a Bad Meets Evil reunion, which seemed to be happening. In April of 2011, it would be officially confirmed that a Bad Meets Evil record was in the works. It was titled Hell, the Sequel, a reference to a line in their song on the Slim Shady LP.
It's not an album, it's an EP, but it's actually a little longer than an EP, but a little bit shorter than an album. We weren't really sure what to call it, so we just call it an EP. Like EP.
I remember this announcement quite fondly as it was huge for me. Just for context, I had been into Eminem before, but this was the year that I really started getting into Eminem at a much deeper level. The reason being is that this was the year that I met my now best friend, which looking back does make this project sort of weirdly time appropriate. Now, ever since I was a kid, I always dreamt of making music. I would listen to records on repeat for hours at a time, studying the inlays back to front. However, being some kid living in the middle of nowhere, music seemed to be an impossibility. I had no idea where to even start, where to get instruments, how to pay for them, how to learn, how to write, how to record, and I always just kind of accepted that. When I met my best friend in January of 2011, he introduced me to FL Studio. He was into EDM and all that kind of music, and he had been producing for a few years at that point. At this point, I started to become almost obsessive with the music that I listened to, particularly Eminem. I was trying to absorb and learn as much as I could. In fact, some of my earliest productions were recreations of Eminem beats. So when the Bad Meets Evil EP was announced, I was ecstatic. When the album dropped in June, I remember sitting down and listening to it in one sitting. The back and forth chemistry between Em and Royce was phenomenal, and they held that energy throughout. In contrast to Recovery, the production was much more hip-hop focused and less poppy, with the exception of a couple songs like Lighters and Fastlane, which were probably the weakest tracks on the album. Granted, they were most likely added to replace the 2 tracks that had leaked the year before, which I think was a mistake, even if those tracks did wind up being on the deluxe edition of the album. Overall, this EP was for the devoted fans. And while I loved Recovery for what it was, I also really loved this project and the return to form we saw with it.
Fist bump, fist bump.
After this, though, Marshall would go quiet for a little bit while he worked on one final project, one that would round off his comeback.
As far as like being a pop star or whatever, like I never intended to be any of that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
and you basically
this isn't weird at all, by the way.
Yeah, no.
This is not awkward at all.
Not at all. It's very natural.
All I ever wanted to do was get respect from, you know, my peers and other rappers, and I have a weird thing with giraffes, man. I'm peeing right now.
I want to talk about a different artist for just a minute here. Johnny Cash.
Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
I imagine most of you watching are probably not too familiar with Johnny and his story. Much like Mathers, he was a troubled artist who struggled with his own addictions. He developed an addiction to amphetamines and barbiturates in the late 50s in order to cope with touring and the rock star lifestyle.
I had become habituated to amphetamines and barbiturates and alcohol, all 3 at the same time. I got up to a habit of as many as 100 pills a day and a case of beer.
By the mid-60s, the over 6-foot Johnny Cash weighed about 150 pounds, and he would even be arrested in 1965 trying to smuggle pills across the border. In the late 60s, he would make an attempt at getting sober, which he would have some success with. However, for the next couple of decades, he would find himself in a cycle of relapsing and getting clean a few times over. By the 80s, his career was looking pretty bleak. Much of his music at the time was not great.
I said, Doc, I've got to have my old brain back.
And he was being forgotten by the country music industry. By the early 90s, he was more or less washed, playing a residency gig in Branson, Missouri. In 1992, that would all change. At Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary concert, Johnny would meet Rick Rubin, who wanted to work with him. Johnny was skeptical, but Rubin would eventually manage to win him over. Now, this was a little bit of an unusual pairing. Rubin had gotten his start in the world of hip-hop, producing acts like the Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, and Run DMC. Then would later work with rock and metal acts like Slayer, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Danzig. But now he would work with Johnny Cash for the next decade on the American recordings. Many, myself included, consider these albums to be Johnny's best work. There's something wonderfully morbid but beautiful about the albums. Johnny was in bad health and rapidly declining, and these albums capture that.
I wanted to ask you, I think people that have no faith probably look at death as something very scary, but you believe and you have faith. I mean, does it make it easier to look ahead and say, well, my life may end, but it's been good, I'm not afraid?
Oh, I expect my life to end pretty soon. You know, I'm 71 years old.
Their recording sessions would end with one of the most iconic cover songs ever, Johnny's version of 9 Inch Nails' Hurt. On paper, it's a bit of an odd choice to have a legacy country act cover a industrial rock song, but it worked so well. A song written by the young, drug-addicted Trent Reznor, now acting as the final bow for an old former addict nearing the end of his life. Rubin managed to turn the last years of Johnny's life around, saved his career, and cemented his legacy. So naturally, when there was talk of Rubin producing the next Eminem album, I was interested. Now, like I said a couple of minutes ago, Marshall would go quiet after Recovery and Hell the sequel. Not a hiatus or anything, just a little step back compared to the last couple of years. Then, on August 16th, 2013, Marshall would announce his next project, a sequel to his much-beloved Marshall Mathers LP. A very bold choice, but again, with Rubin at the helm, I was pretty optimistic. The next day, the album's first single, Berserk, was dropped along with the music video.
Now the shit's about to kick off, this party looks whack.
The song, produced by Rubin, was a throwback to old school rap and paid homage to all of the rappers that Marshall grew up on. The beat was built on samples from Billy Squier, the Beastie Boys, and Naughty by Nature. In the video, we saw Marshall returning with his signature blonde hair, and we got cameos from Interscope and Shady Records artists like Slaughterhouse, Yellow Wolf, and Kendrick Lamar, among others like Kid Rock and, of course, Rick Rubin. It was pretty obvious what Marshall and Rubin were going for, and I remember being pretty interested. Marshall had just spent the last couple of years redefining himself and exploring new sounds, but not everyone loved that new direction. So he was obviously trying to revisit that turn of the millennium sound that everyone fell in love with in the first place. I and many others were quite interested to see how well this would turn out. Not long after that, the artwork for the album would be revealed. To no surprise, it was his childhood home in Dresden, now abandoned, boarded up, and condemned. Admittedly, I don't think the artwork has aged particularly well. It's got that very, early Instagram over-filtered look that really dates it. I mean, in a way, though, it is sort of nostalgic, as it is very of its time, but still. But moving on from that, in September we would get the second single from the album, that being Survival. Which was also a promotional track for the upcoming Call of Duty Ghosts. For that purpose, it was alright, but overall the track just kind of felt like a leftover from Recovery. A little over a week after that, we would get the third single, which would be the absolutely massive hit that was Rap God.
I'm beginning to feel like a rap god.
Another song which I think needs little to no introduction. It literally broke records and had kids in lunchrooms across the country trying to impress each other reciting the third verse. It also continued the trend of poorly aged YouTube parodies.
The slippity hippity damn dog, get early when I get stuck in a fucking rut with a smiggity mud. All buttercup back of his butt. Cut not slow, yeah, yuckity yup yup.
I'm just playing, Welby, you know I love you. It was a technically impressive showcase that had people absolutely hyped for the album, which we would finally get on November 5th. Now, this is a time that I remember quite well, but not very fondly. Remember, this was around the time that my father finally got clean. Long story short, he had gotten pulled over on what later turned out to be a bogus warrant, but he was in possession of drugs. I remember being handed a phone in the middle of, I think, math class, and he was calling from jail, and there was a bunch more going on at the time, but I'm not going to spend a bunch of time going over that. The video's not about me. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for my headspace and where I was at coming into this album. I needed a new Eminem album at the time, and I was really curious how the album would turn out with Rubin producing it. Could this wind up being Marshall's American Recordings? Unfortunately, I don't think the album quite turned out that way. And as much as I did love the album and listen to it on repeat, I do remember being a little bit disappointed with it. The album starts off pretty strong with Bad Guy, which is a sequel to Stan. And although I've never been a huge fan of the beat or the chorus, the concept of the song is great, and I do love the switch up at the end. That then leads into the parking lot skit, which then leads into the first Rubin-produced track of the album, Rhyme or Reason.
Michelangelo with a paint gun and a tantrum about to explode all over the canvas.
And this is where my first real issues with the album come into play. Now, I love the concept of the song itself, however, the mixing is pretty bad. In fact, most of the album is pretty terrible. Everything sounds so incredibly flat and hollow, with the album severely lacking any kind of low end or mid-range, and overall it just sounds very thin and trebly. Marshall's vocals are also incredibly shouty, which in and of itself I don't mind, but they're paired with a really aggressive low pass and compressed far too much, and a lot of the individual instruments and samples on the record just do not sit well with each other in the mix. And overall, I don't really love the classic rock samples. I mean, I think they work well on a few of the songs like Rhyme or Reason, but I think Marshall should have embraced a much more contemporary turn of the millennium sound rather than using those. If we go all the way back to his feature on Kid Rock's album, he sounds great on that track. And I would love to hear more of that from Marshall. Survival is a great example of this. That song would be so much better if instead of having like a generic Toyota-thon riff, it had some guitar work done by like Wes Borland or Monkey from Korn or something like that. In fact, I remember right around the time Tech Nine had an album that he had done with Ross Robinson, which featured some guitar work by Wes. And I can't help but wonder if maybe Ross would have been a better pick for Marshall. Because while I did love the idea of Marshall going back to where he started, I'm not sure that Rubin wound up being the right pick for that. On top of that, Rubin only produced like half of the tracks on the album, which again, I'm really just not a fan of rappers working with like 30 different producers on an album. Please just sit down with one guy and write the album with him. The album also suffers from another classic Eminem problem, putting the best tracks on the deluxe edition, or in this case, as a Call of Duty Ghosts pre-order bonus. Tracks like Survival, Monster, and So Much Better should have been replaced by tracks like Don't Front, Groundhog Day, and Wicked Ways. The last track actually being kind of interesting, as it's the first time where Marshall seems to directly imply that he has Asperger's, which, I mean, yeah. Okay, so this all probably gives the impression that I hate the album, but I really do love the album, and at the time, I listened to it on repeat. Sure, I didn't love the mixing and was a little let down with Rubin, but I do think it is a solid album. However, I think in retrospect, if Marshall had picked a different producer and wrote the entire album with that producer, it could have been as good as the first Marshall Mathers LP. There is a lot of potential with this album. And I also think the album has its upsides. It was a fun little blast from the past, and songs like Legacy and Headlights really struck a nerve with me emotionally, and songs like Evil Twin and Wicked Ways really appealed to the angry, redheaded stepchild that I was at the time. Overall, I think it was a decent end to this era for Marshall, an era that I have and will always have a strong connection to and will always love. An era that defined a part of my life and inspired me to do music. And all of those frustrations aside, the album was a sort of catharsis that I needed at the time, and for that I love it. I just think it's one of those what if albums. What if it had a different producer? What if it was mixed better? What if the track listing was stronger? In fact, if you're all interested, maybe I could do a video where I redo the track lists for Recovery and for this album. I think very few have actually bothered to tackle those albums. 2 days after the release of the album, Marshall's childhood home on Dresden would burn. It's not clear exactly how the fire started, but the already condemned house was burned beyond salvage. A few weeks later, the house was demolished, and as unfortunate as it was, with the house arguably being an important piece of Detroit history, it was, in a way, a fitting end to the saga.